All right, the first component we're going to implement is this link component. So here in our markup, first we're going to delete all these elements and add an anchor. I'm going to give it a class, let's say link-arrow. And for the label, we can say learn more. Now back to our style sheet. First, I'm going to define a new section called links. So this way we can logically separate various rules. And also I realized that in the last lesson, I forgot to add a section for our topography. So over here, we're going to add a section called topography. Good. Now back to our new section. I'm going to define a class called link-arrow. What styles do we need here? Well, first we're going to set the color to color-accent. Then we're going to set text transform to uppercase because every letter in this link is uppercase. Now, our links don't have an underline, and that applies across the board. So if you look at the navigation bar or the footer, none of these links have an underline. So I want to define a new rule here for all anchors and set text decoration to none. This way we don't have to repeat this property for the links in the navigation bar and the footer as well. Okay. Now for the font size, we're going to set this to 2 rems and we're going to set font weight to bold. And of course, I picked all these values from the mobile version of our design. All right, here's what we get. What is currently missing is the arrow after the link. To implement that, we're going to use the after pseudo element selector. So we type link arrow ; after. Now here we're going to set the content to 2 hyphens followed by a greater than sign. If this doesn't work, we can always come back here and add an icon. Now save the changes. All right, here's what we get. I want to add some margin before the arrow. So margin left, we set it to 5 pixels. Now, why am I using a pixel value here? Because I want this space to always be the same no matter how large the font is. I just want to have a tiny bit of space before the arrow. So take a look. I think that looks better. Now, what about the hover effect? When we hover on this, I want the arrow to move to the right. We're going to define another rule, link arrow. Then we're going to go to the hover state and target the after element. So with this rule, we are essentially targeting the element that we dynamically insert here, but in the hover state, okay? Now in this state, I want to increase the left margin. So from 5 pixels, we go to 10 pixels. Now take a look. So that looks pretty good, but the change happened so suddenly. I want to apply a transition and make this smooth. So back to this rule where we insert the arrow, we set the transition property to. Now what property are we animating here? The margin property. So we can say margin should change in 0.15 seconds. Now take a look. That's much nicer. Now if you pay close attention here, this arrow that we have is slightly different from the arrow we just created. But don't worry about that. Again, we can always come back and add an icon. Now let's look at the desktop version. On desktop, our links are a little bit smaller. They're 15 pixels. So once again, we have to write a media query for wider screens. Now we have 2 options. One option is to go back to this media query that we wrote earlier. Perhaps we can move this at the end of our style sheet and then write a new rule for link-arrow and say font size is 1.5 rem. So that's one option. The problem with this approach is that this rule will be far apart from the main rule that we defined for mobile. So every time we want to change something, we have to jump up and down for adjusting the styles for mobile and desktop. So I personally prefer to define the media query close to each component. So we're done with topography here. Now in our links section, I'm going to define another media query here for the links component. So screen and min width 1024 pixels. Again, we're targeting wider screens. So here we define a rule and say link-arrow. Its font should be 1.5 rems. Now you might argue and say, but Mosh, we have repeated this media query. Isn't this bad? Isn't this duplication? Well, this is not really a big issue because how many components are we going to have? Let's say 15 to 20. So we're going to have 15 to 20 extra lines, and those extra lines are not going to increase the size of our style sheet. Also, we don't want to have a single place for defining these breakpoints because, as I told you in the second part of this series, these breakpoints are arbitrary. The value we use really depends on our design. It depends on our components. Maybe for a particular component, we want to change the breakpoint. So we don't want to have a single place to apply styles for all components, okay? So let's quickly test it. Here's the mobile version. Now I'm going to make the browser wider. Good. That's the desktop version. So because mobile screens are small, we use larger fonts for our body text or links so they are more readable. So we're done with this implementation. Now, one thing I like to do is to create a folder called components, and then have a sample of each component in that folder. Later, as we build more complex components, we're going to forget the markup we need. So here in the Explorer panel, let's add a new folder called components. Inside this folder, we're going to add a new file called links.html. And now I'm going to grab this link element from index.html and copy it here. This is just a template. So this is not supposed to be a full-blown HTML page. Just a small template so we know what kind of markup we need for this particular component. All right, we're done here. So once again, we're going to go to the source control panel and make a commit. Going forward, I'm not going to show this in videos because it's going to be repetitive. So for one last time, let's type a message here and say, build the link or arrow link component and make a commit. Beautiful.